Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure which is the scary bit, is me looking at you guys or you guys having to look at me 20 foot tall on the screen here. It's a little bit disconcerting, to say the least. It's also quite nice for me to have done my own introduction without having to do it again for you. So, without any further delay, let's let's look at creating a test approach. Now, one of the jobs I do most, and I have done for several years now, is they wheel me out at the start of a project or the start of a pre-sales, and they say, okay, Steve, how are we going to go about doing testing? And I'm usually expected to come up with an answer fairly quickly. And a lot of that I can do on the basis of experience, but that doesn't necessarily get you so far. I can hazard a guess as to what testing might look like from a very basic description, but that's not really the right way of doing it. So I'm going to talk you through a simple and straightforward approach. Earlier on in the conference, Isabel did a nice presentation on disk profiles, and in that I was quite interested to see that a lot of testers are around the blue-green area. And I remember from doing a training course years ago that actually I'm around in the red segment, which is a bit more around influencing and directing. And it occurred to me that, actually, testers don't, it occurred to me to look it up that all testers don't like change. And they like to follow a plan. Now, I'm not sure whether that applies to all of you guys, but I've certainly seen it in a number of people who've worked in my team. So, if I were to ask a lot of people, and I don't know about yourselves as to when you've been asked to go away and write a test plan, what happens? For a lot of people, something like this. Is the world goes completely blank. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. Now, what I find is a lot of people then fall back on doing what they know how to do, which isn't necessarily right for the project that you're working on. So, going back to sort of first principles, when should we start planning testing? Anyone like to hazard a guess? Not when do we start planning testing, when should we start planning testing? A lot of the time I find that we end up being asked to plan testing somewhere around development. To be perfectly honest, on some occasions I've actually been asked to plan testing just before they do implementation, which is a rather bizarre thing for anyone to want to do. But that's the way of the world. The best place to do it, as with anything, is let's start at inception or initiation. But and throughout the presentation I've got a number of top tips from Steve, and the first one here is let's get involved with the project at initiation, or where it's the best time to do your planning. Now, that gives you a particular set of problems in that at the beginning of a project, there's lots of things we don't know. Okay, so go back to what I said about thinking about from a blank piece of paper. So we've got a blank piece of paper and we don't know very much. Now, that's not a good place to start. But what we can do is think about where are we going with our testing approach. Well, ultimately, we're going to create a test plan of some description. So let's have a look at a typical test plan. Here's one I prepared earlier. There's lots of bits we don't know here, and we're not going to know at initiation. So what we will need to do is to pick out the bits that we can deal with and then start working on those. Now, you can look at the list and decide yourself about which bits you want to do. I think that actually the ones we want to concentrate on are the test approach, which is our basic design about what we're going to do. And in order to do that, we need to have an idea of what's in the scope. And I don't know, there's maybe one or two other things there that we need to get a handle on. So what exactly is a test approach? Now, one of the things I found in testing over the years is that we have an unparalleled ability to invent new names for things and then use something, a particular name or a particular description for something that we use elsewhere. So how many people now are thinking, well, actually, Steve, you're describing a test strategy? Well, yeah, I could be. You could look at it as a test strategy. I prefer to look at it as an approach because I think a strategy is an overall, you know, this is how we do testing as an organization rather than this is how we're going to do testing on a project. Now, yes, you could call it a project test strategy, and I've certainly heard it described as that. I tend to try and make it a bit simpler. Sometimes I get my own way, sometimes I don't. Is people will refer to it as a project test strategy rather than a project test approach. So the definition I pulled from the internet here says the test approach is the implementation of a test strategy for a project and defines how testing will be carried out. That sort of works. I think of it as how testing is going to be carried out. I think as more as what testing are we going to be carrying out. So let's look at a corporate test strategy. And all the examples I'm using here are things that I've used in practice. And this is a corporate test strategy that I wrote or described, and it's a high-level description of the one I described for a local government organisation. What you can see is all of the, well, I say all of, there's a lot of testing types and a lot of activities that you may or may not use in testing. So to pick a few at random, obviously we're going to do test approach, we might do system testing, and all of those things. And in the test strategy, it says to a degree, if you drill down all of these, is how we go about doing, so we say operation acceptance testing. How do we do UAT? And there are other things in the strategy that will be of use to all projects. So this is how we manage defects. This is the standards we use for documentation. This is how we define a test case, and all good stuff like that. None of which we need to worry about particularly when we're creating a test approach. That's the how we're going to do it rather than the what we're going to do. And the way I look at a testing strategy like this is it's actually a bit like a sweet shop. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the sweet shop and choose the sweets that we particularly want. Now, the analogy doesn't quite work there because, I don't know, I'm guessing you all know, I've seen licorice all sorts. I don't like coconut, so that rather rules out some of the sweets in the shop. That doesn't mean to say that I wouldn't go and do that particular type of testing or choose that from my sweet shop. I don't particularly like doing unit test. Even as a developer, I didn't like you doing unit test. But it doesn't mean to say that I don't need to do it for a particular project. Another way of thinking of your sweet shop there is if we went and got all the sweets and ate them, we'd probably be a bit uncomfortable in the tummy, and we would spend a lot of time and money eating them, and all that would happen is we get fat. Not a good thing to happen. And the same is true with testing. If we try to implement everything in the testing strategy, we'll be doing things that we don't need, and we'll be spending money that we don't need to spend, and we'll be consuming time that we don't, well, a lot of the time we don't have. So the right test approach is specific to a project, tailored to the project, make sure that it's appropriate for that project. And it's not implementing every part of the testing strategy. Now, a good example of that is, one that appears very often when I'm doing a strategy, is thinking about performance testing. Now, the testing strategy says we should do performance testing. Okay, great. But do we need to do performance testing? Now, that's always a very good question, because that kind of thing is, a lot of the time, performance testing is a bit of an optional extra. But let's say we're testing a timesheet application written by a third party. Do we need to performance test that? Well, the answer is yes or no. If it's for most companies like ours, we are about 70 people, the idea of doing a load test or any test like that is, well, why are we doing it? There's only 70 people. The chances of 2 people using it concurrently are nothing. We only do 1 entry a day. There's not a huge volume. If you take the same application, though, and you put that in the context of the National Health Service back in the UK, which has 250,000 people, then maybe, well, hang on a second, maybe we do want to check it will cope with the load. You can also look at the health service in a slightly different way, as people will tend to do their timesheets all at the same time when they come off shift. So you have great peaks and troughs. To be fair, in our organisation, most people only do their timesheets when we're chased by the administrator, but there's still only 70 people. So we have to think about that around our test approach. So another little tip here is always think about your test approach to balance your project risks. If there's no risk to your project about load testing, or sorry, about load, then don't do the testing. No need. It's quite simple. So this is what I use, this is the approach I use to create a test approach. We use the word approach quite a lot now, and what I do is getting engaged with the project, fortunately at initiation most times. But what I'll do is I'll get hold of the documentation, have a read through, and I'll normally get an idea of what my test approach is going to be. Now, I've done lots of them, so it's quite useful that I can think back. Actually, there was a project last year, that's broadly similar. But I don't want to commit to this yet. I want to continue thinking about it. Because sometimes you can't read everything and someone will tell you something different, which is why we go and talk to the project team. All the key people should be available to you in the project team. So let's go and talk to them. Let's have a chat and see how it works. From that, I should be able to formulate at least a first draft test approach. Now, I don't know how many of you were at the keynote speech yesterday, where Niels was talking about design. And this is very much design, is what you want to do is to create your test approach on the back of a cigarette packet or whatever we use these days, a piece of paper, draw it out, sketch it out. Don't waste a lot of time preparing flashy graphics or anything. That's enough for the moment, because when you walk it through with the project team, again, it will depend on how you prefer to do it. And I do recommend you go and talk to the project team and guide them through it rather than just email it, which is something we do tend to do a lot these days. And when you walk it through, you can walk it through on a whiteboard. And that's again, is a very good place. So you think about it, I go away and I write on my whiteboard here, and I don't like this bit, or someone says that bit doesn't work, I can quickly rub it out and start again. I haven't wasted any time doing things that are not going to be used. From the walkthrough, you'll get some feedback, you'll get some refinement, you'll begin change things. Depending on the size of your project, you may have to go through this several times, but at the end of it, and very quickly, in terms of the amount of time it takes me to prepare the test approach, actually working on it, it's probably only a few hours. It's not a huge amount of time, but it usually takes a good 2 weeks by the time you've managed to get everyone together, you've found the documentation and so on and so forth. And that's always a little bit of a challenge, is trying to get it done. Once you've got that, we can issue it for approval. So here's an example, and this is actually a project we were working on, and I couldn't believe how simple it was. But it still needs thinking about in exactly the same way as anything else. The client I'm working with has lots of applications that run on Oracle databases, and every single application has got a separate instance of Oracle on separate servers, and in a lot of cases in separate data centers, and it's really not very efficient. So they're moving across to Oracle Enterprise. They're going to have a great big Oracle farm. Well, I'm not an Oracle expert, so I don't really know how it works. But they tell me this is an enterprise quality one, so if something runs out of storage, they can borrow it from somewhere else, or they can add more storage, or they can do whatever it is. So nice and easy. Looking at the impact assessment from the guys who are the technical experts, they said, okay, both oracles are running on the same version. Although we're going to migrate from standard to enterprise, the upward path works. It's not going to be a problem. It would be different if you're going the other way, apparently. So what we can do as an approach for the project is lift and shift the database. Take a backup, restore it to the new system, connect the pointers back up, job done. Other bits of information that may or may not be useful from the impact assessment are it's used 8 till 8 every day, and there's 100,000 active customers. Now at the moment, if I was faced with that from scratch, I'm not entirely sure what the last two pieces are giving me, but I get the other one is, this is telling me I don't need to do a lot of testing. So let's go along and talk to the project team. And I usually stick to a formula which says, let's talk to the technical guy, find out how it all works. Let's talk to the business guys, find out what worries them about it, and talk to the project manager about the schedules. So again, this is giving me the parameters to work with to build my test approach. A lot of the time you can talk to the business people, and in this case we talked to the business people and they were saying, oh, this is going to be awful, we're going to have to repeat all the testing we did last time. And you said, okay, well what was last time? We had an upgrade to the system. And as far as they understand it, this is an upgrade to the system. It's, from a technical point of view, we all know, actually this is easy, we could probably have done it without telling them. They wouldn't have noticed. But it's important to make sure everyone's engaged. So at this point, you can have the conversation with them that says, actually guys, the application's not changing, nothing about it. It's still where it was, still on the same hardware, still on the same version, nothing changes. And so that's good PR for a start, as well as helping you with your test approach. And once you've done that, well, certainly for me, in my head, I've now got the idea of what it is that I need to do from a project testing point of view. So I can go away, and in my head I've done this, and we're going to look at it in just a second. I'll show you how we go through the testing strategy and say, okay, this is what we need to do. So another top tip, engage with the project team. Don't try and do it all on your own. It doesn't particularly work. Now, there are a lot of other things we need to consider when doing a test approach. These are just some of them. Now, I don't mean to knock development teams particularly, but how good is the development team is an important thing, because that tells you a lot of information about where do we need to focus testing on. I'm not going to pick on development teams, but I will pick on suppliers, and there are some suppliers that I know produce extremely poor quality systems into acceptance testing. So what that means is I can, because I've got that knowledge, that understanding, I can make an assessment that I'm going to need to do extra testing. Normally, I wouldn't do a supplier's system test for them. But if I think they're not doing it, I'm going to have to put that in my budget to be done. If you're getting a third-party system, are there any bespoke changes? Is the supplier doing changes for you? That again is important, because if you think of you're going to get perhaps implement a new version of Excel. Excel is Excel is Excel, and it's probably going to work. Okay? Anyone think Excel won't work when you get a new version? No, I got one cynic up in the back there. But in general, the only one I've ever heard of was in the stats functions, and I never use the stats functions because I don't understand what they are. So to me, it's a no-brainer. I'll install it. I don't have a problem with it. However, we put a payroll product in, payroll system. This should be absolutely dead standard, except I'm working for the States of Jersey government, which has slightly different rules, and the guy said, no problem, we'll just configure it. 2 years later, they are still implementing it because they cannot get the changes right. So that's worth thinking about. And for later on is think about, have we got the right, do we have the right experience in the team? Because if you're a test manager in a small company, you may need to hire people in with specific skills, and that's worth thinking about. So again, another top tip, while we're doing this, we're making a lot of assumptions. I assume the supplier is going to do their system testing properly. Document it, keep a note of it. You'll need it later when you come to do your test plan. And you'll never remember what they are either. So, let's have a look at creating a test plan. Now, I've just done this with 3 pieces of information. Here's what I've got from my project brief and my impact assessment. And we're going to go through each of the steps and say, do we need them? Okay, for this one, sorry guys, I'll turn my back to you so I can see what I'm doing. The first thing we look at is, do we need to do a test approach and estimates? And I think that's quite straightforward. Yes, of course we do. So what we'll do is we'll put that in our test approach. Do we need to do a requirements review? Well, there is only one requirement. The requirement is move the database from here to here. So I don't think it's worth spending time and effort doing a formal requirements review. So let's just lose that for a second. Do we need to do unit testing, component testing? Nope, nothing there. System testing? No changes to the system. I wouldn't waste time system testing anything to do with Oracle. That's got to be brick built. Let's not worry about that too. Factory acceptance testing. For those not familiar with the term, we do factory acceptance testing where we get a supplier to demonstrate to us, this is how we've met your requirements. This is how our system works. And we tend to do that before the quality gate, because usually then that into acceptance test, there's a milestone payment, and suppliers do a lot of stuff if they think they're going to get paid for it, and not so much afterwards in warranty. It's a good point. But no, we don't need that. Do we need system integration testing? Maybe. There's an integration, which is, have we got the pointers right between our Oracle databases? And I say, yeah, okay, but do I want to spend all that time and effort creating a system integration test plan for one test? No. Okay, so we'll put that one away then. Regression testing, applications not changing in any way, shape or form. We can forget that. Now we come to the trickier one, UAT. Okay. Yes, we do. And rather than a UAT which says we users accept this because we like this new system and we can work with it, this is just giving the users confidence that they can still do what they used to do. And it's not going to be huge. I think we came up with about 20 tests. Basically, can I log on? Can I find a customer? Can I amend them? Does the amendment stick? And can I produce a report? Really, that's it. But it's still a UAT that we need to do. Non-functional testing, I don't think there's anything in there. I'm sure you'll agree. Even though there's 100,000 customers, nothing's changing. Maybe the Oracle database will run slowly, but DBAs tell me, I don't see DBAs here, usually anything running slowly is a quick change to the indexes and it will run quick again. Now, I believe them, so we're fine with that. Operation acceptance. Now, I'm sure you're all thinking, no, we don't need to bother with that. Well, I think you do. Imagine that the database alerting is still on the old system when you go live with the new system, new Oracle. So it's telling the operational teams everything's fine and dandy, but you're running out of space on the new server. So again, it's only a small test in this instance, but it needs doing. And of course, we now need to do test completion. So that's our test approach. That was quick and easy. Great stuff. We need to document it a little, shall we say, a little tidier. And I usually do a format something like this. So it's a bit of a hybrid between what testing are we going to be doing and the process we're going to use. But what I do is get this on one sheet. When it's on one sheet, and usually I have an A3 sheet, so I can carry it around with me and I can write stuff on the corners. When I find new pieces of information, I can show it to people. This is the approach we're going to use for this. And when you come to write your test plan, a nice coffee-stained piece of paper is really a good place to start. So what we've done here is we've taken some elements from our sweet shop and we've actually put them into our test approach. So we now have a test approach that is appropriate to the project, and this is the project that we're working on. Now, of course, that is extremely oversimplified, but it's also important to remember, let's not dig into the detail at this point. You know, the understanding that there's only a few tests, or we only need a few tests, is great. You don't need to worry about writing them or working out whether they're the right ones. What you're trying to do is to get the feel for what it looks like. You can always change it later, and you will find that things do change. So for example, we've made this big assumption that the application that we're working on isn't going to change. Now, you can bet your pension that someone in the organization is thinking, you know, we're doing this database move, it'd be a really good idea to upgrade the software to version 1.3.1. And that changes your whole approach. So we have to go back to it and revisit it. Now, if all you've done is create a plan like that, sorry, without the suites, but in Visio or in PowerPoint, it takes a few minutes to change it. You haven't spent a lot of time doing it, but what you have done is you've got all the background, all of the information you need. We can work on from this and create our schedule. So we can work with the PM to create what looks like a testing schedule. We can think about our resource estimates and cost estimates, but sadly not in the 40 minutes I've got to talk to you about today. Here's one that maybe looks a bit more appropriate, and this is one I usually use as a starter for a third-party supplied system. What we do here is our test planning. We need to do a requirements quality review, and then we can go into our quality gate that says, are we ready to go live? Are we ready to give this to the developers? A bit of an aside here, but I think that's a very, very important part of the testing process, is to make sure that you've got these quality gates in place as well. So at this point what we're saying is I'm not going to give it to development until I'm happy that the requirements have been written properly. Now, what I would say from a testing point of view is that this, when you're putting your approach together, what I'm going to do here is make sure that I can test everything. Because if I can't test it, if I can't think of how to test the requirement, how are they going to develop it? It's very true. That if it's if you can't think how to test it, the developers are going to be making assumptions, and if they make assumptions, assumptions usually end up in disaster when we hit testing. Next thing is having handed that over, so our approach says we expect the supplier to do a build and test. Remember earlier I said an assumption, that I make an assumption that the supplier will do system testing and all the other testing they need to do to an acceptable level. Well, here's where we can maybe influence that. Maybe we think because the supplier's not, we know the supplier isn't very good, we can make a note on our test approach that says, actually, let's go and check this. Or as we've done recently on several projects, is we've actually embedded a senior test professional into the supplier's organisation, so we can check there and say, yes, things are being done to a reasonable level. I would say quickly that's not policing them. What we're trying to do is help them and say this is what this is how it's going to work better. Then on to the factory acceptance test, where we'd like them to come along and say, okay guys, this is how we've done it. So again, a little tip in there, which is the factory acceptance test is a very good place to find out how things work. So we may have written a test that says we need to add a customer. This is where we find out that adding a customer is actually a very torturous process. And believe me, I've seen one or two of those. As I said earlier, we now have a quality gate out of our factory acceptance test, which says, okay, we're happy with what you've delivered. We're good to go into our testing. And within our acceptance testing, I use, I tend to include one, and the name changes every time we do it, but a business verification test. Thank you. What we're doing with the business verification test is to say, okay, we've got your system. Now, in the main these days, we don't just get a system in and it operates standalone. We get a system in, it connects to various other ones. So, for example, our payroll system connects to finance, connects to social security, connects to tax. I think it connects to 2 other systems. All of that needs to be connected up and make sure that it all works. And before we get the users engaged, because if the users get engaged and it doesn't work, they don't like it. Don't know why. Surely you'd like a day off from the day job and come in and find you can't log in. No, of course they don't. They're usually very enthusiastic about it. But what we want to do is do that part of testing. So I include that. It may well be, if you're using this approach on a project, you don't. That's fine. All comes back to getting your sweets out of the sweet shop. Then we've got a proper UAT, and in parallel we're running our non-functional test and operational acceptance test. Now, this is maybe oversimplified. You may think that you can talk about it better by putting in the test types you're going to do under non-functional testing. So you may have load testing, you may have security testing and all the other things. And I think that's entirely down to you and to how you want to do it. But it's still that same principle of start early, start simple, and justify what you're doing. With non-functional testing, I tend to take an approach that says, I am not going to do any. That's a bit radical. But from there, what I can do is to then justify what I do need to do, rather than starting from a position that says, I need to do all of this, and then cutting it out. And I think that's a good way of doing it. Let's try and work out why we shouldn't do non-functional testing. I think the 2 that you always have to do are UAT, because you've got to have the users accepting it, and operational acceptance, which is where your teams will work out that they can actually run the system and keep the lights on. So, finally, top tips, and as a good summary as well, do get involved with the project initiation. And you say, well, how do I do that? Well, you know what projects are upcoming. Be proactive, get engaged with people. The earlier you get engaged, the more influence you have. By the time you get down to the later cycles, it's all set in stone, there's no money, There's no time and all manner of things. Make your testing appropriate to the risks, engage with your project team, and absolutely document your assumptions. And remember, above all, is try and keep it at high level. Don't get dragged down into the detail. All it does is confuse you. And when you're trying to do an approach, and oddly, when you're trying to do a presentation like this, starting out with a few rough bits written on a piece of paper makes it a whole lot easier, and you're not, when you make a mistake, it's very easy to rub it out. Thank you very much.